The year was 1819, and a profound silence had fallen over Windsor Castle, a silence that was more than just the absence of sound. It was the quiet of a long reign drawing to a close, the hush that gathers around a king who has been lost to the world for years. King George III, the man who had once ruled a vast empire and battled his rebellious American colonies, was now a frail, blind, and deaf old man, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own palace, trapped in the winding labyrinth of his own mind. For a decade, the kingdom had been governed by his profligate son, the Prince Regent, while the true monarch existed in a state of perpetual twilight, his days marked not by affairs of state but by the simple, sad routines of his confined existence in the secluded chambers of the castle. It was in this heavy, expectant atmosphere that a young man named Thomas Harland found himself, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Thomas was not a courtier or a politician. He was a humble junior archivist, a man whose life was normally spent among dusty ledgers and crumbling parchments in a dark corner of the royal household's administrative wing. His ordinary world of ink stains and careful cataloguing was shattered when he was summoned unexpectedly to the office of Sir Reginald Thorne, the keeper of the royal archives, a man as ancient and severe as the documents he protected. Sir Reginald, his face a web of wrinkles that spoke of a lifetime of frowning, did not offer Thomas a seat. Instead, he pointed a bony finger towards a large, iron-banded chest that sat on his desk, a chest that seemed to radiate a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Harland!" Sir Reginald's voice was a dry rasp, like dead leaves scraping against stone. "This coffer was delivered from the king's private apartments. His Majesty, in his more lucid moments, which are fleeting as shadows now, has been writing. Pages and pages of it. No one understands why, or what it means. The Prince Regent has ordered it all sealed away, deemed it the ramblings of a madman, of no historical consequence." He fixed Thomas with a piercing gaze. "Your task is to inventory the contents. List every page, every fragment. You are to read nothing. You are to comprehend nothing. You are merely to count and describe the physical items. Is that perfectly clear? The official line is that these writings do not exist. Your discretion and your silence are absolute." Thomas, his throat dry, could only nod, his eyes fixed on the mysterious chest. It was an object of plain, intimidating functionality, but to him, it seemed to glow with a forbidden allure. He carried it back to his small, windowless office, the weight of it feeling far heavier than its physical mass. Once the door was closed and locked, he placed the chest on his desk and simply stared at it for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on him. The air grew thick with the dust of centuries and the scent of old wood and iron. Finally, with trembling hands, he broke the wax seal, a blob of red imprinted with a lion and a unicorn, and lifted the heavy lid. The smell that wafted out was complex and unsettling, the familiar scent of old paper and ink, but underneath it, something else, a faint, medicinal aroma, the smell of chamomile and something sharper, something like despair. Inside, the chest was filled to the brim with sheets of paper, some crisp and new, others yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was erratic, a frantic scrawl that slanted wildly across the page, sometimes so forceful that the quill had torn through the parchment. It was the handwriting of a mind in torment. Remembering his orders, Thomas took a deep breath and began his work, determined to be the dispassionate archivist. He picked up the first sheet, intending only to note its size and condition. But his eyes, against his will, were drawn to the words. They were not the incoherent babble he had been expecting. They were a confession, a plea, a secret history scrawled in the dark. The very first line seized him by the heart, and refused to let go. "They told the world I was mad because I saw the truth, because I knew the bargain my grandfather made in the shadows of the Herrenhausen Palace, a bargain for the throne that cost us our soul, a debt that must be paid in the blood of the heir, and the time for the payment is now." Thomas dropped the page as if it had burned him. His breath caught in his chest. This was not madness. This was a secret, a dangerous, terrifying secret that reached back through generations of the royal family. He looked around his tiny, locked office, suddenly feeling exposed. The words of the king, a man the world had dismissed as insane, hinted at a conspiracy, a pact with some unseen power, a threat that was imminent. The they the king referred to, Who were they? Were they the same people who had declared him unfit to rule? Was his illness not a natural affliction but a carefully managed prison? And the Prince Regent, who had so quickly ordered these writings sealed away, what was his role in all this? Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not simply inventory these pages and forget them. He had stumbled upon a mystery that lay at the very heart of the kingdom, a mystery that the most powerful men in Britain wanted buried. The fate of the king, perhaps even the fate of the nation, was hidden within this frantic script. He was just one insignificant man, but he held a king's last testament in his hands. He carefully smoothed out the page he had dropped, his earlier fear now replaced by a grim and terrifying resolve. He had to know more. He had to read on, even if it cost him his position, his freedom, or even his life. The silence of the castle was no longer just the quiet of an old man's dying days. It was the silence before a storm, and Thomas Harland, the junior archivist, had just heard the first, distant rumble of thunder, a sound that began with the frantic scratch of a quill on paper in the final days of a lost king, a sound that would lead him into a labyrinth of shadows from which there might be no escape. A journey that started with the next page, and the next terrifying sentence that would pull him deeper into the secret that was never meant to be found, a secret that began with a single, shattering sentence that promised nothing but danger. Of course, here's part 2 of the story, continuing directly from the last line of part 1 and expanding significantly in length and detail. The sentence hung in the silent, dusty air of the office, not as mere ink on paper but as a living, breathing entity of dread, and Thomas Harland felt its cold tendrils wrap around his heart, squeezing with the promise of ruin. They told the world I was mad because I saw the truth, because I knew the bargain my grandfather made in the shadows of the Herrenhausen Palace, a bargain for the throne that cost us our soul, a debt that must be paid in the blood of the heir, and the time for the payment is now. He read it again, and then a third time, each word etching itself deeper into his mind, transforming from a cryptic statement into a key that threatened to unlock a door behind which lay things that should never see the light of day. The initial shock, a sharp, electric jolt, began to subside, replaced by a low, thrumming terror that vibrated through his very bones. This was no longer a simple archival task. It was a precipice, and he had already stepped over the edge. The locked door of his office, which moments before had felt like a barrier protecting him from the outside world, now felt like the lid of a coffin, trapping him inside with a secret that had the power to shatter the kingdom. His eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the cramped room, the towering shelves sagging under the weight of mundane histories, the single guttering candle that cast long, dancing shadows that now seemed menacing, the tiny, grimy window that showed only a sliver of the darkening Windsor sky, and he felt an overwhelming sense of his own insignificance. He was a speck, a nobody, a man whose name would be erased from the payroll without a second thought, and yet he held in his hands a confession that could topple the very foundation of the House of Hanover. The weight of the chest on his desk was immense, not just of wood and iron, but of generations of buried sin. His orders from Sir Reginald Thorne echoed in his ears, a stark warning that now sounded less like a professional instruction and more like a threat to his personal safety. You are to read nothing. You are to comprehend nothing. Your discretion and your silence are absolute. But how could he unread what had been seared into his vision? How could he unknow the king's desperate, scrawled truth? To ignore it now would be a betrayal not just of the tormented old man strapped to his bed somewhere in the castle above, but of his own conscience, of the very history he had dedicated his life to preserving. The king was not mad. He was a prisoner of a truth so horrific it had been branded as insanity to silence him. And the Prince Regent, the flamboyant, wasteful George, who was even now probably hosting some lavish banquet while his father languished, was he merely a beneficiary of this silence? Or was he an active participant in the conspiracy? Was he the heir, whose blood was the payment for this ancient debt? The thought was too colossal, too terrifying to fully grasp. With a hand that trembled so violently he had to steady it with the other, Thomas reached back into the chest. He bypassed the first page, its message already a brand on his soul, and carefully lifted the next sheet. This one was different. The paper was older, brittle and yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting, while bearing the distinct characteristics of the king's script, was tighter, more controlled, as if written in a moment of painful, hard-won clarity before the final descent into frantic desperation. He laid it flat on the desk, smoothing its creases with a reverence he usually reserved for medieval charters, and leaned close, the candlelight throwing the frantic letters into sharp relief. This page was not a declaration. It was the beginning of the story, a plunge into the past that made the danger feel even more immediate. To understand the cage I inhabit, the writing began. One must journey back to a time before my birth, to the reign of my grandfather, George II, and to the ambitions of his father, the first George, our progenitor who came from Hanover. The court then was a nest of vipers, a foreign imposition on English soil, and our hold on the throne was precarious, challenged by the Jacobites who dreamt of restoring the Stuart line. My grandfather, ever a practical man, was also a deeply superstitious one, haunted by the curse of his own father's coldness and the constant fear of losing what they had gained. It was in the year 1727, upon the death of his father, that the event transpired. He traveled to Herrenhausen, our ancestral home in Hanover, not merely to mourn but to secure his position. And there, in the geometric precision of those gardens, amidst the fountains and the orangery, he met a man who was not a man. Or so the story was whispered to me by my mother, Princess Augusta, in hushed tones when I was but a boy, a warning she intended to steer me from the darkness that had already begun to cling to our line. She called him the Shadow Minister, a counselor who appeared from nowhere, a man of immense persuasion and unsettling calm, who promised my grandfather a dynasty unshakable, a line of kings that would rule Britain for generations, securing the Hanoverian name against all rivals. The price was not gold or land, for such things are transient. The price was a tithe of sanity, a recurring vulnerability in the male line, a susceptibility, to be claimed at a time of the benefactor's choosing, a payment that would ensure the continuity of the bloodline itself. Thomas had to stop reading, his mind reeling. A tithe of sanity. The words were so archaic, so chillingly specific. This was no political scandal. This was something older, darker, something that belonged to the realm of folktales and witch hunts, yet here it was, written in the hand of a king. He thought of the king's famous madness, the episodes that had begun decades ago, the reports of frantic conversations with unseen people, the restraints, the isolation. The world called it porphyria, a disease of the blood, but the king, in this terrifying testament, was calling it something else entirely, a scheduled payment on a supernatural debt. He forced himself to continue, his eyes devouring the words. The bargain was sealed in blood, a single drop from my grandfather's finger upon a parchment that, my mother claimed, felt like living skin. The Shadow Minister vanished, and the Hanoverian succession, indeed, became remarkably secure. The Jacobite rebellion of '45 was crushed, and our house was cemented. But the cost soon became apparent. My grandfather grew increasingly paranoid. My own father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died suddenly, under circumstances many called suspicious, before he could take the throne. And then it fell to me. I felt the weight of the bargain from my first day as king. A coldness in the palace corridors that had nothing to do with the drafts, a sense of being watched from the portraits of my ancestors, their eyes seeming to hold a pitying warning. My periods of agitation, what the physicians call my madness, are not a sickness of the body, though they manifest as such. They are the moments when the veil thins, when the Shadow Minister's claim is felt most strongly. It is a presence, a pressure in the mind, a whispering that promises oblivion. For years I fought it. I built a life of routine and piety, hoping to ward off the darkness through sheer force of character. But a bargain is a bargain. The debt must be paid. And the specific term, the final payment I have come to understand in my moments of lucidity is this. Upon the death of the reigning monarch, the soul of his firstborn son, the heir, is forfeit, to be consumed by the darkness that granted us the throne in the first place. Not just his sanity, but his very essence. I am dying. I feel the cold hand of death upon me every hour. And when I breathe my last, the debt falls due. It will claim my son, George. It will hollow him out, leaving a shell upon the throne, a puppet for the shadow that has owned our family for nearly a century. They have locked me away, calling me mad, not to protect the nation from me, but to protect their secret from the nation. They, the keepers of this awful truth, Men in my court, perhaps even my own physicians, ensure I am silenced. These writings are my only act of true kingship left. A warning, cast into the future, hoping that someone, anyone, might find it and understand. The time is now. The payment is imminent. God save the king, for no one else can. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his body slick with a cold sweat. The single candle had burned down considerably, casting the room into deeper gloom. The silence was now absolute, a physical weight. He looked from the page to the chest, which now seemed less like a container and more like a gaping maw into a history of Gothic horror. The king's story was insane, but it was insane with a terrible, internal logic. It explained the sudden stability of the Hanoverian dynasty after a shaky start. It explained the peculiar, recurring madness that seemed to strike the monarchs at key moments. And it explained the frantic urgency in the king's script. He wasn't just dying. He was a king trying to prevent the damnation of his son and the corruption of his kingdom. Thomas was that someone. He was the one who had found the warning. The responsibility was crushing. What could he, Thomas Harland, possibly do? Go to Sir Reginald? He was surely one of them, one of the keepers of the secret. Go to the authorities? They would laugh at the junior archivist and his tale of supernatural bargains. Or worse, they would make him disappear to protect the state. Warn the Prince Regent? The prince would likely see it as a treasonous plot or the ravings of a madman, and Thomas would find himself in the tower. He was utterly alone, trapped with a truth that was too big for him to hold. Yet, to do nothing was to be complicit in whatever horrific event was about to unfold. He thought of the Prince Regent, a man known for his excesses and his weaknesses. Was his character already a result of the looming debt, a vulnerability being prepared for the taking? The king's words painted a picture of a fate worse than death, the utter annihilation of the self. Suddenly, a sound pierced the profound silence, a soft, scraping noise at the door. It was the subtle sound of a key being inserted into the lock. Thomas's blood ran cold. Sir Reginald had a key. Or someone else. Someone who knew. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. With a speed born of pure panic, he scooped up the 2 pages he had read, folded them with frantic haste, and shoved them not back into the chest but into the inner pocket of his waistcoat, against his chest where they felt like a burning brand. He then grabbed a handful of random, older-looking documents from a shelf, innocent tax records from the previous century, and spread them over his desk, covering the empty space where the king's pages had been. He snatched up a quill and dipped it in ink, just as the lock clicked and the door began to swing open. He forced his hand to steady, to begin making a meaningless notation on a ledger, hoping the frantic pounding of his heart wasn't audible in the small room. He did not look up, pretending to be engrossed in his work, every muscle in his body tensed for the confrontation. The door opened fully, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, not the stooped frame of Sir Reginald, but a taller, broader man, a palace guardsman. The man's eyes, cold and assessing, scanned the room, lingering on the iron-banded chest, which was still open, and then on Thomas, who kept his head down, his pen scratching falsely against the paper. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the guardsman spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Archivist Harland?" Thomas finally looked up, feigning surprise. "Yes? Can I help you?" "The keeper, Sir Reginald, wishes to see you in his quarters." "Immediately." The command was delivered without emotion, but the timing was too perfect, too coincidental. Had Sir Reginald had second thoughts? Had he been watched? Was this a summons or an arrest? Thomas's mouth was dry as dust. "Of course," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "I'll just tidy my desk." He made a move to close the chest, his heart in his throat. "Leave it," the guardsman said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The keeper said immediately, "Come with me." Thomas had no choice. He stood up, his legs feeling like water. The 2 pages hidden in his waistcoat felt like they weighed a ton, a secret now physically pressed against his skin. As he walked towards the door, forced to leave the chest open and exposed, he cast one last, desperate glance at the damning cough. He was being led out of his dim office and into the vast, shadowy labyrinth of Windsor Castle, a place filled with whispers, secrets, and enemies he could not even name, to face a man who might very well be his executioner, the first step into a darkness far deeper than the night outside, a darkness that had been waiting for him for 100 years, a darkness that began with a king's pen and a bargain in a garden, and now rested squarely on the shoulders of one terrified young man who knew too much. The walk from his cloistered office deep in the administrative bowels of Windsor Castle to the private quarters of Sir Reginald Thorne was a journey through layers of time and power, each corridor a narrowing artery leading closer to the cold, still heart of the conspiracy. The guardsman, whose name Thomas never learned and whose face was a mask of impersonal duty, walked a precise 2 steps behind him, a silent, looming presence that made every one of Thomas's nerves scream with the instinct to run. But where would he run to? The castle was a stone labyrinth, and he was a mouse trapped within it, the 2 folded pages in his waistcoat now feeling less like a secret and more like a target painted directly over his heart. The rustle of the paper against his shirt with each step was deafening in the silence between them, a constant reminder of the king's frantic script, the bargain of Herrenhausen, the tithe of sanity, and the imminent payment of the Prince Regent's soul. He tried to steady his breathing, to compose his features into the bland, obedient expression of a junior archivist summoned by his superior, but his mind was a whirlwind of terrifying calculations. Had Sir Reginald discovered the missing pages already? Was that the reason for this abrupt, ominous summons delivered by a guardsman and not a servant? Or was this a routine check-in, a perverse test of his compliance? The king's words echoed. They, the keepers of this awful truth, men in my court, perhaps even my own physicians, ensure I am silenced. Sir Reginald Thorne, keeper of the Royal Archives, was the very definition of a keeper of secrets. He was a man who had curated history itself for decades, deciding what was preserved and what was consigned to the fire. He was perfectly positioned to be one of them. The route they took was not the usual path through the public halls. Instead, the guardsmen steered him through a series of increasingly narrow and dimly lit service passages, where the grandeur of the castle gave way to bare stone walls smelling of damp and old mortar. The portraits here were of forgotten minor nobles, their eyes seeming to follow Thomas with accusatory stares. The sound of their footsteps changed from the echo on polished marble to a dull thud on worn stone flags, and the air grew colder, carrying a chill that seeped into Thomas's bones. They were moving away from the inhabited, lively sections of the castle, deeper into its ancient, secretive core. Thomas's sense of dread intensified with every turn. This was not the way to Sir Reginald's official study, a place Thomas had been to only once before to receive a reprimand for a misplaced inventory ledger. That room had been cluttered but warm, with a large window overlooking a courtyard. This path felt like it was leading to a dungeon. Finally, they stopped before a heavy, unadorned oak door, blackened with age and studded with iron nails. It looked like a door that belonged in a medieval keep, not in the residence of a senior court official. The guardsman didn't knock. He simply produced a large, old-fashioned key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open, gesturing for Thomas to enter. "Wait inside," the man said, his voice flat. "The keeper will be with you shortly." Thomas stepped across the threshold, and the door shut behind him with a solid, final thud. The sound of the key turning in the lock again was unmistakable. He was a prisoner. The room he found himself in was unlike any he had ever seen in the castle. It was Sir Reginald's private sanctum, and it was a reflection of the man's soul, severe, orderly, and chillingly devoid of warmth. It was a large, circular chamber, likely housed in one of the castle's oldest towers. A single, high, narrow window let in a sliver of moonlight, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the cold air. There was no fireplace, and the room was bitterly cold. The walls were not paneled or decorated. They were bare stone, from floor to ceiling, and every inch of that vertical space was occupied by shelves. But these were not the messy, overstuffed shelves of the main archives. These were meticulously organized, containing rows of identical, dark leather-bound folios, each spine labeled not with words but with a complex system of numbers and symbols etched in gold leaf that Thomas did not recognize. In the center of the room stood a massive, circular table of dark wood, devoid of any chair, as if the room's occupant always preferred to stand, to be ready. On the table lay a single, open folio, its pages filled with the same cryptic script as the spines. The air smelled of old leather, dried ink, and something else, a faint, acrid scent that reminded Thomas of static electricity before a storm, or of a church after a candle has been snuffed out. This was not a library. It was a mausoleum for secrets, a vault where the true history of the crown was interred, and Thomas felt like an intruder at a graveside. His eyes, adjusting to the gloom, were drawn to the only personal item in the room. On a small, stand-alone lectern near the table, rested a single object, a large, oval portrait miniature in a gilded frame. It depicted a young man in the formal dress of the early 18th century, his face pale and handsome, but with a haunting sadness in his eyes. There was something familiar about the line of the jaw, the set of the eyes, and then Thomas realized with a start who it was. It was Frederick, Prince of Wales, the father of King George III, the man who had died suddenly before he could take the throne. The man whose death, according to the king's writings, was part of the pattern, perhaps even an early, failed attempt to claim the debt. Why would Sir Reginald, a man of the present, keep a portrait of a prince dead for 70 years in such a place of honor? Unless his connection to the secret was not just professional, but ancestral. The thought was ice in Thomas's veins. He didn't have long to ponder. A hidden door, a section of the bookshelf so perfectly seamless he hadn't noticed it, swung open silently, and Sir Reginald Thorne entered the chamber. He had changed from his formal court attire into a simple, dark woolen robe, making him look less like a court official and more like a monk or an inquisitor. His wrinkled face was grim, his eyes, usually merely severe, now held a penetrating, unnerving intensity. He did not greet Thomas. He simply walked to the central table, placed his bony hands upon it, and stared across the room at the terrified young archivist. The silence stretched, thick and accusing. "Harland," Sir Reginald finally said, his voice low and devoid of its usual dry rasp, now possessing a dangerous, smooth quality. "The chest. You opened it." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He had prepared a dozen denials, but faced with the old man's knowing gaze in this terrifying room, they all died on his lips. He could only manage a feeble nod. "And you read?" Sir Reginald continued, taking a slow step forward. "Despite my explicit instructions, you read the words of a king the world believes to be mad. You dipped your quill in ink you cannot possibly comprehend. A dangerous pastime, boy." "Sir, I was inventorying as you ordered," Thomas stammered, the lie sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "The handwriting, it was difficult. I had to look closely too." "Do not insult my intelligence," Sir Reginald interrupted, his voice like a whip crack in the silent room. He was now standing directly in front of Thomas, and Thomas could smell the faint scent of camphor and old parchment on him. "I have spent a lifetime reading the truth behind the lies men tell. I can see it in your eyes. The fear. Not just the fear of being caught in disobedience, but the fear of what you have learned. The fear of the shadow." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Shadow. It was the same term the king had used. The shadow minister. Thomas felt all resistance drained from him. He was caught. The only thing left was the truth, or a version of it. "The king, he speaks of a bargain," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "A debt. He says he is not mad." Sir Reginald's lips twisted into a humorless smile, a crack in the marble of his face. "Of course he is not mad. Not in the way they mean. He is afflicted. He is a debtor being called to account. And his affliction is the proof of the bargain's power. It is the interest on the loan, paid in bouts of agony and confusion throughout his life. The final payment, the principal, is now due." He turned and walked back to the table, tracing a finger over the cryptic symbols in the open folio. "You think you have stumbled upon a great secret, Harland. You have not. You have stumbled into a system of governance older than Parliament, more powerful than the crown itself. You have found the bedrock upon which this dynasty is built. A necessary foundation for all its cost." Thomas stared at him, horrified. Sir Reginald was not denying it. He was confessing to it, explaining it as if it were a matter of "I am the keeper," Sir Reginald said, emphasizing the title. "As my father was before me, and his father before him. We have served the crown in this capacity since the bargain was struck. We are the librarians of the pact. We ensure its terms are remembered, its conditions met. We smooth the path for the succession. The king's illness had to be managed. His writings, his attempts to reveal the truth, had to be contained. It is for the stability of the realm. The stability of the realm? Thomas burst out, a surge of courage born from disbelief. You call damning the soul of the Prince Regent to some darkness stability? The king called it a hollowing out. Sir Reginald turned on him, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. What is one's soul weighed against a century of peace? Against the prevention of civil war? The Stuarts would have plunged this nation back into chaos. The bargain guaranteed order. George, for all his flaws, will remain on the throne. He will continue to reign. The alternative was anarchy. The king, in his sentimental folly, thinks only of his son. I think of Britain. He is your king, Thomas cried, gesturing wildly towards the door, in the direction of the king's apartments. He is a tormented old man, and he is begging for help. He wanted someone to know. He wanted to stop it. And now you know, Sir Reginald said, his voice dropping back to a deadly calm. And that, Mr. Harland, is the problem. You are not a keeper. You are not part of the design. You are an anomaly. A loose thread. And loose threads must be clipped. He picked up a small, silver bell from the table and rang it once. The sound was pure and sharp, seeming to cut through the very air of the room. The hidden door opened again, and the same guardsman entered, his face impassive. Thomas's heart hammered. This was it. He was to be clipped. He thought of the pages in his waistcoat. They were all that remained of the king's warning. He had to get them out, to someone, anyone. But how? Sir Reginald spoke to the guardsman without taking his eyes off Thomas. Take Mr. Harland to the King's Lynn repository. He is to be assigned there indefinitely. Effective immediately. He will accompany the midnight supply wagon. See that he speaks to no one before he departs. The King's Lynn repository? Thomas had heard of it. It was a remote, decaying storage facility on the Norfolk coast, a place where documents were sent to be forgotten, a Siberia for archivists. It was not a death sentence, but it was a burial alive. It was a way to make him disappear without a fuss. To silence him as effectively as they had silenced the king. The guardsman stepped forward and took Thomas's arm in a grip of iron. As he was turned towards the door, Thomas made a desperate, last-second decision. As he stumbled, he pretended to lose his balance, clutching at his side as if in pain. With a furtive movement, he slipped the 2 folded pages from his waistcoat and shoved them deep between the pages of a random leather-bound folio on the nearest shelf. It was a reckless act, a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of secrets. He had no hope of retrieving them, but he could not bear the thought of Sir Reginald destroying the king's own words. Let them remain here, in this vault, a seed of truth buried in the heart of the lie. Sir Reginald watched him, a faint frown on his face, but said nothing. As Thomas was marched out of the room, back into the cold corridor, the old keeper's final words followed him, echoing in the stone passageway. Farewell, Mr. Harland. Do not think on this matter again. The world you knew is over. The designs of kings and keepers are not for the likes of you. The payment will be made, the dynasty will continue, and all this will be nothing but a forgotten whisper in the walls. The heavy door closed, and Thomas was plunged into the darkness of the passage, the guardsman's grip unyielding. He had failed. He had been discovered, neutralized, and was being sent into exile. The king's warning would die with him in a forgotten repository. The debt would be paid. The Prince Regent's soul would be forfeit. And as he was led away, a new, even more terrifying thought occurred to him. If Sir Reginald and his lineage were the keepers, then who or what was the Shadow Minister? The king had written of him as a man who was not a man. The true beneficiary of this horrific bargain was still out there, an ancient, unseen horror waiting in the wings of history for its final, terrible payment. And Thomas Harland, now a prisoner in all but name, was the only soul alive outside the inner circle who knew, and he was being taken away, powerless to stop the clock from striking midnight on the House of Hanover. The wagon to King's Lynn awaited, a rolling prison cell that would carry him away from the heart of the mystery, even as that mystery prepared to reach its bloody, apocalyptic conclusion just a few hundred feet above, in the silent bedchamber of a dying king. The midnight supply wagon, a rattling, canvas-covered contraption that smelled of old vegetables, damp soil, and the sharp tang of the coal it had previously carried, became Thomas Harlan's prison on wheels, a claustrophobic box jolting him away from the only world he had ever known and into an exile that felt like a living death, each turn of the heavy wooden wheels on the cobblestones of Windsor not just putting physical distance between him and the castle but hammering home the finality of his situation, the absolute power of the keepers who could, with a few quiet words, erase a man's life and consign him to a forgotten corner of the kingdom as easily as they might misplace an unimportant ledger. And as he sat huddled in the dark corner of the wagon, his back against a sack of potatoes, the guardsman who had delivered him sitting impassively at the rear with a musket across his knees, Thomas felt a despair so profound it was a physical ache, a cold hollow in his chest where hope had once been, for Sir Reginald Thorne had been right. The world he knew was over, and the designs of kings and keepers were indeed not for the likes of him. A lowly archivist who had dared to peek behind the curtain of history and had been blinded by the horrific truth he found there, the king's words echoing in his mind like a funeral dirge, the bargain of Herrenhausen, the tithe of sanity, the debt to be paid in the blood of the heir, all of it now destined to unfold without any interference, the Prince Regent doomed to a fate worse than death while he, Thomas, was being shipped off to a coastal backwater to rot in silence, his fate a mere footnote to the grand, terrible narrative he had accidentally discovered. The journey through the sleeping town of Windsor and out into the dark countryside was a blur of shadows and the occasional lonely light from a cottage window, each light a reminder of the normal, ignorant lives being lived just beyond his reach, lives untouched by ancient pacts and royal damnation, and he envied those people with a ferocity that shocked him, envied their simple worries of harvest and health, their blissful unawareness of the shadow that was about to fall upon the very pinnacle of their nation. The guardsman never spoke, his presence a constant, grim reminder that this was not a journey but a deportation, and Thomas, his mind reeling from the shock and the relentless jolting of the wagon, eventually slipped into a fitful, nightmare-ridden doze, where visions of a faceless shadow minister mingled with the frantic, sightless eyes of King George and the smug, severe countenance of Sir Reginald, all set against the backdrop of the geometrically perfect, terrifying gardens of Herrenhausen. He was awoken by a sudden, violent lurch and the sound of shouting. The wagon had come to an abrupt halt, tilting dangerously to one side, and the guardsman was on his feet, cursing, his musket now held ready. "Stay here!" the man growled at Thomas before jumping down into the darkness. From outside, Thomas could hear the driver arguing with another man, their voices raised in anger, and then the sound of a scuffle, a heavy thud, and a groan. His heart began to pound, not with fear for himself, but with a sudden, wild, and utterly irrational spark of hope. Was this a rescue? Had someone else learned the truth? Cautiously, he peeled back a corner of the canvas covering and peered out. They were on a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by dense woodland. The driver was slumped on the ground, unmoving, and the guardsman was facing a tall figure clad in a dark, heavy cloak that obscured his features. The two men were circling each other, and Thomas saw the glint of steel in the moonlight. The guardsman had drawn a short sword, but the cloaked figure held a long, wicked-looking blade that seemed to drink the light. The confrontation was silent and deadly serious, a far cry from the common highway robbery Thomas had initially assumed. The guardsman lunged first, a professional, efficient thrust, but the cloaked man moved with an unnatural speed, parrying the blow with a casual flick of his wrist and, in the same fluid motion, driving his own blade deep into the guardsman's side. The man gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and crumpled to the ground without another sound. Thomas stared, frozen, as the cloaked figure stood over the two fallen men for a moment, then turned and walked towards the wagon. This was no rescuer. This was something else entirely. Panic seized Thomas, and he scrambled backwards, looking for a weapon, an escape, anything, but there was nothing in the wagon but sacks of produce. The canvas flap was thrown back, and the cloaked figure stood there, silhouetted against the night sky. He was immense, and even in the dark, Thomas could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Thomas Harland," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held no discernible accent, a voice that seemed as old as the stones of Windsor. "Get out. We do not have much time." Paralyzed with terror, Thomas could not move. The man reached in, his grip like iron, and hauled him out of the wagon as if he weighed nothing, setting him on his feet on the muddy road. Thomas expected to be run through immediately, but the man simply studied him for a long moment, his face still hidden in the deep shadow of his hood. "You read the king's words," the man stated, again without any hint of a question. "You know of the bargain." Thomas, his voice a trembling whisper, could only manage, "Who are you? Are you with Sir Reginald? Did he send you to kill me after all?" A low, humorless laugh emanated from the hood. "Thorn? That pompous librarian? He believes he is a player in this game, but he is merely a custodian of the ledger. No, boy. I am not with the keepers. I am the reason the bargain exists." He reached up and slowly pushed back his hood. The face that was revealed was not what Thomas expected. It was not a monster's face, nor was it the face of the aristocratic shadow minister he had imagined. It was a strong, weathered face, lined with the marks of a hard life, with a broken nose and a jaw covered in a short, grizzled beard. But his eyes were what held Thomas captive. They were a pale, piercing gray, and they held an ancient, weary knowledge, eyes that had seen centuries pass. "My name is Johann Conrad," the man said, his voice losing none of its power. "In the year 1727, I was a soldier in the service of the Elector of Hanover, a man without a future. That was the year I met an entity, for lack of a better word, in the forests near Herrenhausen. It offered me a purpose, a long life, and power beyond my station, in exchange for serving as its agent in the world of men. I became the intermediary. I was the one who approached George Ludwig, the first George, and later his son, with the offer. I am the shadow minister your king wrote of. Or rather, I was the face he saw." Thomas felt the world tilt around him. This man, this solid, flesh and blood man, was claiming to be the architect of the royal family's curse. It was too mundane, too human. "But," the king said, "a man who was not a man, a bargain for a soul." Conrad nodded, a grim expression on his face. "The entity I serve is not of this earth. It does not have a form men can comprehend. It requires anchors, conduits. A royal soul, steeped in the power of a nation, is a potent vessel. The bargain was never for mere political stability. That was the bait. The true purpose was to prepare a bloodline, to cultivate a specific lineage until the moment was right for the entity to fully manifest, to wear the air like a suit of clothes and rule this world from the throne of one of its greatest empires. The madness is the strain of the soul resisting the presence of the entity, a presence that has been attached to the Hanoverian line since the pact was sealed. The king's affliction was the entity testing its connection, probing the weaknesses in the royal psyche. Now the king dies. The entity believes the prince regent, a man of weak will and strong appetites, is the perfect, pliable vessel for its final incarnation. He paused, his ancient eyes boring into Thomas. But it miscalculated. The king, in his torment, developed a strength, a purity of will that made him an unsuitable vessel. And his son, for all his flaws, is still his son. The entity's plan is an abomination. I have served it for a century, but I will not be a party to the utter annihilation of a man's soul and the subjugation of a nation to a thing from beyond the stars. I have come to stop it." Thomas stared at him, his mind struggling to process this new, even more incredible layer of the story. The keeper of the secret was now the would-be savior? "Why?" Thomas breathed. "Why now? After all this time?" Conrad's face hardened. "Because I was a young, desperate fool when I made my own pact. I wanted power and immortality. I did not understand the true cost, the true nature of the horror I was inviting into our world. I have spent 100 years watching the consequences unfold, watching good men be broken, watching a family be tormented for a purpose they never understood. I am damned for my role in this, but I will not see this world damned alongside me. The king's writings were my last hope. I knew Thorn would have them sequestered. I have been watching the archives, waiting for someone, anyone, to discover them, to become an unexpected variable in the entity's ancient design. You, Thomas Harland, are that variable. You are the one thing it did not foresee, an ordinary man with a conscience. He gestured to the two bodies on the ground. These men were loyal to Thorn. Their orders were not just to take you to King's Lynn. They were to ensure you had an accident along the way. A drowning, perhaps. Your disappearance was always the plan. I intercepted them. The reality of his narrow escape washed over Thomas, leaving him weak-kneed. He had been moments from a silent, anonymous death. This man, this centuries-old soldier, this former agent of darkness, was his only chance. What can we do? Thomas asked, the "we" feeling strange and momentous on his tongue. The king is dying. The Prince Regent is in London, surrounded by courtiers. Sir Reginald knows I know. The entity, it is waiting. Conrad nodded, a glint of determination in his old eyes. The transfer cannot happen at a distance. The entity is bound to the bloodline, but to fully possess the heir, it must be present at the moment of the king's death, in close proximity to the heir. It will be drawn to the seat of power, to the place where the king dies. It will be at Windsor. And so must the Prince Regent. We must get the prince away from the castle before the king passes. We must break the physical proximity. But how? Thomas exclaimed. We are two men. You expect to just walk into Windsor Castle and kidnap the future King of England? Conrad allowed another grim smile. Not kidnap. Persuade. We must make him believe the truth. And for that, we need more than the ravings of his mad father. We need proof. Thorn keeps a copy of the original pact in his chamber. It is written on a material that is not parchment, in inks that are not of this earth. It is the only thing that might convince a skeptical man. We must retrieve it. The audacity of the plan was staggering. Breaking back into the very heart of the castle, into Sir Reginald's secret sanctum, to steal the physical evidence of the supernatural bargain, all while the king lay on his deathbed, and the unseen entity gathered its strength for the final assault. It was a suicide mission. But as Thomas looked at the two dead men on the road, and then into the weary, resolute face of Johann Conrad, a man who had sold his soul and now sought to buy it back with one impossible act, he felt the cold despair in his chest begin to thaw, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. He had been given a chance, a sliver of hope where none existed. He was no longer a passive victim being carried to his doom. He was an actor in the drama. He nodded, his own voice steady for the first time since he had opened the chest. Then we go back. Conrad clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. Good. But first, we need to disappear. Thorn will soon know his men have failed. We must move like ghosts. He led Thomas off the road and into the dark woods, leaving the broken wagon and the dead men behind them, two figures now bound together by a secret history and a desperate race against time, heading not towards exile, but back towards the epicenter of the storm, back to Windsor Castle, where a king was dying, a keeper was waiting, and an ancient evil was preparing to claim its royal prize. The woods surrounding the road to King's Lynn were not a place of rustic charm but a primordial darkness. A tangled labyrinth of ancient oaks and grasping undergrowth that seemed to swallow the very concept of light, and as Johann Conrad led Thomas Harland away from the scene of the ambush, the two dead men and the crippled wagon vanishing into the blackness behind them like a bad dream, Thomas felt as if he were crossing a threshold from the world of reason history he had always known into a older, wilder realm where the rules were written in shadow and blood, each crack of a twig underfoot sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence, the air thick with the damp smell of rotting leaves and wet earth, a stark contrast to the dusty, paper-scented confines of the archives that had been his entire life. Conrad moved with an uncanny silence, his large frame weaving through the trees with the instinctual grace of a predator, a man completely at home in the night, and Thomas struggled to keep up, his city-softened feet slipping on mossy stones and his clothes snagging on thorny branches, the physical discomfort a mere footnote to the churning chaos in his mind. The story Conrad had told him was too vast, too horrifying to fully comprehend, an ancient entity from beyond the stars, a century-long grooming of a royal bloodline for possession, and this weathered soldier who had been the catalyst for it all, now seeking redemption in the 11th hour. It was the stuff of the Gothic novels he sometimes sneaked looks at, but it was real, and he was now a character trapped within its pages, his every action carrying the weight of a kingdom's future. They walked for what felt like hours, until the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy, painting the world in shades of gloom, and finally, Conrad stopped beside a small, fast-moving stream, its water black and icy cold. "We rest here," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the morning hush. "But not for long. Thorn will have scouts looking for any sign of us by full light." He knelt by the stream, cupped his hands, and drank deeply, and Thomas, his throat parched from fear and exertion, did the same, the water so cold it made his teeth ache. As they sat on a fallen log, the reality of their situation settled upon Thomas like a physical weight. "This proof you speak of," Thomas began, his voice hesitant. "The original pact. Where exactly is it in Thorn's chamber? And how can we possibly get to it? The castle will be on alert after my disappearance." Conrad stared into the swirling water of the stream, his pale eyes distant. "The chamber you were in is his public sanctum. The true vault, the one that holds the oldest and most dangerous secrets, lies beneath it. There is an entrance, concealed within the mechanism of the central table. The pact is kept there, along with other artifacts of the entity's influence over the years. As for gaining entry..." He turned his gaze to Thomas, and there was a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. "We will not be breaking in. We will be walking in. But to do that, you cannot be Thomas Harland, the disgraced archivist. And I cannot be Johann Conrad, the ghost from the past." From a pouch on his belt, Conrad produced a small, worn leather kit. Unrolling it, Thomas saw an array of tiny pots of pigments, fine brushes, and what looked like small, flesh-colored wax pellets. "A soldier learns many trades in a century," Conrad said by way of explanation, "including the art of changing a man's face." What followed was an hour of intense, uncomfortable transformation. Conrad worked with the swift, sure hands of a master, applying the wax to Thomas's face to alter the shape of his nose and brow, using the pigments to darken his skin and create the illusion of wrinkles and shadows, and finally, from another pouch, producing a wig of short, graying brown hair and a set of simple, rough-spun clothes to replace Thomas's own. When he handed Thomas a small, polished metal mirror, the young archivist gasped. The face staring back at him was that of a stranger, a man 20 years older, with a weathered, humble countenance, a journeyman or a minor tradesman. "From this moment," Conrad instructed, his voice firm, "you are Elias Thorn, a scribe from Canterbury, summoned to assist with the copying of legal documents pertaining to the king's estate. Your papers are in order." He produced a forged document seal and a letter that looked impeccably authentic. Conrad continued, already applying his own minimal disguise, a touch of gray to his temples, a different style of clothing that suggested a man of modest means but some education. "Am your minder, Master Miller? We are insignificant. We are beneath notice. That is our greatest weapon." As the sun rose fully, casting long, golden shafts of light through the trees, they left the woods and struck out across fields, eventually joining a main road bustling with the morning traffic of farmers taking produce to market, pilgrims heading to shrines, and merchants on wagons. Blending into the crowd was surprisingly easy. As two unremarkable men on foot, they were invisible. The journey back towards Windsor was a study in surreal tension for Thomas. Every sight of the castle's towers in the distance, growing larger with each step, filled him with a mixture of dread and a strange, defiant purpose. They spoke little, but Conrad used the time to impart crucial knowledge. "The entity is not omnipotent," he whispered as they walked. "It is a parasite, a consciousness that exists in the spaces between worlds. It feeds on order, on structure, on the psychic energy of a stable, powerful bloodline. The king's madness was a crack in that structure, a flaw it could not fully control. When the king dies, the energy of the transfer will be immense, a beacon that will draw the entity. It will be at its most vulnerable during the process of possession, focused entirely on the heir. That is the moment we must disrupt. Not before." By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Windsor. The town was abuzz with a palpable tension. Flags flew at half-mast, and people spoke in hushed, solemn tones. The news was everywhere. King George III was not expected to live through the night. The Prince Regent had arrived from London and was in the castle. The final act was beginning. Pushing down his panic, Thomas, in his new identity as Elias Thorne, followed Conrad through the crowded streets towards the castle gates. The usual guards were supplemented by extra troops, their faces stern. Conrad approached a sergeant, presenting their forged papers with a calm authority. Elias Thorne, an associate, summoned by the Lord Chamberlain's office for the documentation, he said, his voice now carrying the slightly officious tone of a minor functionary. The sergeant glanced at the papers, then at their unassuming faces, and waved them through with a bored grunt. They were inside. The castle grounds were a controlled chaos of anxious courtiers, grim-faced physicians, and scurrying servants. The air was thick with the smell of beeswax, incense, and an undercurrent of fear. No one paid any attention to two more nondescript men heading towards the administrative wing. Navigating the familiar corridors was a strange experience for Thomas. He walked the same path he had taken just the day before, but as a different man, seeing the stone walls and tapestries through a lens of terrifying knowledge. They reached the corridor leading to Sir Reginald's tower chamber without incident. The door was, as expected, locked. Conrad, however, did not break it down. Instead, he produced a set of lockpicks from his pouch and, with a few deft clicks, had the door open in seconds. A useful skill, was all he said as they slipped inside, locking the door behind them. The circular room was exactly as Thomas remembered it, cold, severe, and filled with the silent weight of its secrets. The portrait of Frederick, Prince of Wales, still watched them from its lectern with sad eyes. "The entrance to the lower vault is here," Conrad said, moving to the central table. He ran his fingers along a seemingly decorative carving of a lion's head, pressing it in a specific sequence. There was a soft, grinding sound, and a section of the floor beneath the table, which Thomas had assumed was solid stone, slid sideways, revealing a narrow staircase descending into utter blackness. A wave of cold, damp air, carrying a smell like ozone and old graves, washed over them. Conrad took a lantern from the wall, lit it with a flint from his pouch, and handed it to Thomas. "Stay close. And do not touch anything. The things down here are reactive." The staircase was steep and narrow, carved directly into the bedrock upon which the castle was built. They descended for what felt like a long time, the air growing colder and the silence more profound, until they emerged into a small, circular chamber that took Thomas's breath away. It was not a room of shelves and ledgers. The walls were covered in symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, symbols that hurt Thomas's eyes to look at for too long. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on that pedestal rested a single object, a large, flat stone, dark and smooth like obsidian, upon which were inscribed words in a language that was no language Thomas had ever seen, the letters seeming to writhe and shift in the flickering lantern light. But it was not the stone itself that was most horrifying. It was the items arranged around it on smaller stands. A lock of pale hair, tied with a black ribbon, Thomas knew instinctively it was from the first King George. A small, ornate music box that emitted a faint, discordant humming though it was closed. A doll, crudely fashioned from wax and cloth, dressed in miniature royal robes, with a pin stuck through its chest. And finally, a goblet, tarnished black with age, with a dark, rust-colored residue staining its interior. "Souvenirs," Conrad said, his voice tight with disgust. "Tokens of its influence. The hair from the signatory. The music box that played in the room of the prince who died. The effigy used to encourage the king's first major episode. The cup that held the medicine that kept him docile." He pointed to the central stone. "And there is the pact. Written not in ink, but in a substance that is part of the entity itself. It is alive, in a way." Thomas stared at the stone, a primal fear rising in him. This was no longer about politics or history. This was an altar to a malevolent power. "How do we use it to convince the prince?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "We take it," Conrad said simply. "We show him. The stone's nature is self-evident. No human hand could have made this." He reached for the stone, but as his fingers neared it, the symbols on the wall flared brighter, and a low, subaudible hum filled the room, a vibration that felt like it was coming from inside Thomas's own skull. Conrad hesitated, his face a mask of concentration and pain. It is protected. The entity knows this place is being violated. Suddenly, from the staircase above, they heard the sound of the hidden door sliding open, followed by the unmistakable, dry rasp of Sir Reginald Thorne's voice, filled with a cold, furious triumph. I knew it. I felt the disturbance in the wardings. You are a fool, Conrad. And you, Harland, are a persistent gnat that should have been swatted. They were trapped. The only way out was the staircase, and Sir Reginald was blocking it, likely with armed guards. Conrad's eyes met Thomas's, and in them, Thomas saw not fear, but a fierce, final resolve. The race was now a battle, and it had begun in the heart of the darkness itself. The low, menacing hum emanating from the obsidian packstone seemed to intensify, vibrating up through the soles of Thomas's boots and into his very bones, a physical manifestation of the entity's awareness that its inner sanctum had been breached, and the sound of Sir Reginald Thorne's voice from the top of the narrow staircase was like a death knell. His words dripping with a venomous satisfaction that echoed in the small, symbol-covered chamber. I knew it. I felt the disturbance in the wardings. You are a fool, Conrad. And you, Harland, are a persistent gnat that should have been swatted. Thomas's heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, seemed to freeze solid in his chest. They were cornered like rats in a cellar, the only exit blocked by the one man who represented the full, merciless power of the conspiracy, a man who would not hesitate to kill them both and leave their bodies to rot in this unholy vault, their disappearance just another unsolved mystery in the castle's long history. He looked desperately at Johann Conrad, whose face in the flickering lantern light was not etched with panic but with a grim, almost serene acceptance of the violence to come, his body coiled like a spring, his ancient eyes calculating the angles of the cramped space, the distance to the stairs, the number of opponents likely standing behind Sir Reginald. The stone, Harland, Conrad hissed, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. When I move, you grab it. Do not look at the symbols. Do not think about what it is. Just take it and run. Your only task is to get it to the prince. Before Thomas could protest that such a thing was impossible, that they were hopelessly trapped, Conrad let out a roar that was not entirely human, a raw, guttural cry of defiance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber, and in one fluid, explosive motion, he snatched the lantern from Thomas's paralyzed hand and hurled it not up the stairs towards Sir Reginald, but directly at the wall covered in the pulsating green symbols. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The glass of the lantern shattered, and the spilled oil ignited, but instead of a normal fire, the flames that erupted were a blinding, actinic white, feeding on the unnatural energy of the symbols, which flared like a miniature sun, releasing a wave of searing heat and a psychic shockwave that felt like a physical blow, throwing Thomas backwards against the pedestal that held the packstone. Sir Reginald screamed, a high-pitched sound of rage and pain, and momentarily recoiled from the top of the staircase, blinded by the sudden conflagration. Now! Conrad bellowed, his form silhouetted against the terrifying white inferno. Acting on pure instinct, Thomas turned, wrapped his arms around the cold, unnaturally smooth surface of the obsidian stone, and heaved. It was far heavier than it looked, as if it were carved from a piece of a dead star, but adrenaline lent him a strength he didn't know he possessed, and he wrenched it from the pedestal, clutching it to his chest. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of icy cold shot through his entire nervous system, and a cacophony of whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in a forgotten, guttural tongue, flooded his mind, threatening to overwhelm his sanity. He stumbled towards the staircase, where Conrad was already engaging the enemy. The fire on the wall was dying down as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind scorched, blackened stone and the acrid smell of ozone and burnt metal. Sir Reginald, his face a mask of soot and fury, was descending the stairs, a silver-headed cane in his hand that he held like a rapier. Behind him, 2 more guardsmen were pushing their way down. Conrad met them on the steps, his long blade a blur of steel in the dim light. The confined space made it a brutal, close-quarters fight. Conrad moved with the impossible speed and precision of a man who had spent a century honing his craft, disarming the first guardsman with a twist of his wrist and driving the hilt of his sword into the man's temple, sending him crumpling unconscious down the steps. The second guard was more skilled, But Conrad was a force of nature, parrying a thrust and driving his own blade through the man's shoulder, not a killing blow but a disabling one, and the guard cried out, dropping his weapon. Sir Reginald, however, saw his opening. As Conrad was engaged with the second guard, the old keeper lunged forward, not at Conrad, but at Thomas, who was struggling up the stairs with the heavy stone. The silver-headed cane whipped through the air, striking Thomas hard on the side of his head. Stars exploded in his vision, and he would have fallen and dropped the stone if Conrad hadn't reached back with an iron grip, steadying him while simultaneously shoving the wounded guard aside. "Run, boy! Up the stairs! Don't look back!" Conrad roared, turning to fully face Sir Reginald, who stood between them and the exit to the study above. Thomas, his head ringing, the chaotic whispers from the stone screaming in his mind, staggered past the two fallen guards and up the remaining steps, bursting out into Sir Reginald's circular study. He stumbled towards the main door, but a cry from Conrad made him hesitate. He turned to see the two old men locked in a deadly struggle at the foot of the staircase. Sir Reginald, for all his age, was surprisingly strong, and his cane was revealed to be a sword cane, the silver head now detached, revealing a thin, deadly blade. He was pressing Conrad hard, his attacks fueled by a fanatical fury. "You betrayer!" Sir Reginald spat, his blade flashing. "You would undo a century of order for what? For sentiment? For this worthless scribbler?" Conrad parried the blows, but Thomas could see he was tiring, the centuries of his life finally weighing on him. "Order built on damnation is a prison, Thorn. You were just too blind to see the chains," Conrad countered, driving Sir Reginald back a step. It was then that Thomas saw his chance. The hidden door to the study was still open. He couldn't leave Conrad. Setting the heavy stone down for a moment, he looked around for a weapon. His eyes fell on the heavy, gilded portrait miniature of Frederick, Prince of Wales. Without a second thought, he grabbed the lectern it rested on, a solid piece of oak, and with all his strength, hurled the entire thing down the staircase. It wasn't a precise attack, but it was unexpected. The lectern and portrait crashed into the narrow space between the two combatants, causing Sir Reginald to stumble backwards in surprise. It was the distraction Conrad needed. He surged forward, his blade slicing across Sir Reginald's sword arm. The keeper cried out in pain, his own blade clattering to the stone steps. Conrad didn't finish him. Instead, he turned and bounded up the stairs, grabbing Thomas and the pack stone. A noble gesture, but foolish. He grunted, shoving Thomas towards the main door of the study. "Now run!" They burst out into the corridor, which was, mercifully, still empty. But the sounds of the fight and the strange energy released from the vault would not go unnoticed for long. Alarms would be raised. "The prince?" Thomas gasped, hefting the cold, whispering stone. "Where is he?" "He will be in the royal apartments, near his father," Conrad said, his breathing ragged as they ran. "But we cannot just approach him. Thorn's men will be everywhere. We need a diversion. A spectacle so great it will draw every eye in the castle." As they rounded a corner, they skidded to a halt. A group of courtiers and physicians were gathered outside a set of large, ornate doors at the end of the hall, the king's bedchamber. The air was thick with a palpable sense of impending death. A tall, florid-faced man in an extravagant, brocaded coat was standing slightly apart from the group, his expression a mixture of boredom and anxiety. It was the Prince Regent. He was here. The moment was now. But how to reach him? Conrad's eyes darted around, and then a grim smile touched his lips. He pointed to a large, floor-to-ceiling tapestry that depicted a hunting scene, covering a section of the wall near the king's door. There, behind that tapestry, there is a servant's passage that leads to an antechamber beside the bedchamber. It is how the physicians come and go without being seen. It is our only way. They slipped behind the heavy fabric, finding a small, plain door almost invisible in the wall. Conrad picked the lock with frantic speed, and they ducked inside, finding themselves in a narrow, dark passageway that smelled of liniment and sweat. They could hear the muted voices from the bedchamber just on the other side of the wall. The Prince Regent was saying something in a petulant tone about the draft. Thomas's mind raced. What could they possibly do? Burst in and present the stone? They would be cut down by guards before they could utter a word. And then, a thought, desperate and insane, occurred to him. He looked at the pack stone in his arms, feeling its alien coldness, hearing its maddening whispers. It was a thing of power. A focus. What if he could use it not just as evidence, but as a weapon? What if he could show the prince the truth, not tell him? He remembered the way the symbols on the wall had reacted to the fire. "Conrad," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking with the audacity of his idea. "The entity is drawn to this stone, yes? It is part of it. What if we force it to show itself? Here. Now. In front of the prince. Let him see what is waiting for him." Conrad stared at him, a look of dawning understanding mixed with horror on his face. "You would use the pact as bait? It is incredibly dangerous. You could draw the entity to us prematurely. It could try to possess you. We have no choice." Thomas insisted, the whispers in his head growing louder, more insistent. "It's the only way he will believe us. We have to make him see." Before Conrad could argue further, Thomas made his decision. Holding the heavy stone out in front of him, he closed his eyes, trying to block out the fear, and focused all his will, all his intention, on the stone, not on the whispers, but on the entity behind them. He thought of the king, tormented and blind. He thought of the prince, arrogant and doomed. He poured his desperation, his hope, his plea for the truth to be revealed into the cold obsidian. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone grew icy cold, so cold it burned Thomas's hands, but he refused to let go. The whispers became a roar. The symbols etched into its surface began to glow with the same sickly green light as the ones in the vault, casting an eerie, pulsating illumination down the dark passageway. A wind began to blow from nowhere, cold and carrying the smell of a long-dead world. From the other side of the wall, in the king's bedchamber, a sudden commotion erupted. There were shouts of alarm, cries of fear. The Prince Regent's voice, shrill with panic, rose above the others. "What is this? What sorcery is this?" Thomas pushed open the door to the antechamber, Conrad at his side, both of them stepping out into a scene of chaos. The king's bedchamber was filled with a swirling, unnatural gloom, the green light from the stone cutting through it like a blade. The physicians and courtiers were backing away in terror, their eyes fixed not on Thomas and Conrad, but on a space in the center of the room, above the bed where the frail, skeletal form of King George III lay breathing his last. There, the air was rippling, distorting, and from that distortion, a shape was beginning to form, a vast, shadowy, multi-limbed outline that had no place in the world of men, a presence of pure, ancient malice that was now visible to every eye in the room. The entity had been summoned. The Prince Regent stood frozen, his face a mask of utter, petrified horror, staring at the thing that had been promised his soul. The truth was no longer something that needed to be explained. It was there, hovering in the air, a nightmare made manifest. The race was over. The battle for the soul of the heir had truly begun. The manifestation of the entity was not a sudden apparition but a terrifying, gradual violation of reality, a slow, sickening seepage of something from a dimension of pure chaos into the ordered world of the king's death chamber, the air above the royal bed thickening and curdling like spoiled milk. The very light bending and twisting around a form that was less a shape and more an absence, a hole in the fabric of existence through which poured a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and a pressure that threatened to crush the sanity of every soul present, the multi-limbed, shadowy outline that Thomas's mind had desperately tried to categorize now resolving into something far worse, a constantly shifting, pulsating mass of darkness that suggested impossible angles and fleeting, half-glimpsed features that were both insectoid and vaguely human. All eyes and grasping tendrils, a being whose very presence screamed a fundamental wrongness that made the stomach clench and the brain recoil. The green, pulsating light from the pack stone in Thomas's arms was now a beacon, a tether connecting this world to the entities, and the whispers that had been confined to Thomas's mind now became an audible, psychic drone that filled the room, 1,000 maddening voices speaking in unison of ancient, hungering voids and the sweet fragility of human souls. For a moment, absolute, petrified silence gripped everyone except for the dying king, who, in a final, shocking moment of lucidity, let out a weak, rasping cry that was torn from the depths of his being, a single, agonized word that cut through the drone. "Begone!" Then chaos erupted. Courtiers screamed, not the dignified gasps of shock but raw, animalistic cries of terror, scrambling over each other to get to the doors, which had slammed shut of their own accord, their handles glowing with the same sickly green light. Physicians dropped their bleeding bowls and potions, crossing themselves or simply collapsing to their knees in catatonic fear. In the center of this maelstrom, the Prince Regent stood utterly transfixed, his florid face drained of all blood, leaving it a pasty, doughy white, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it seemed to have frozen him solid. He was staring directly at the entity, and the entity, in turn, seemed to be focusing its entire, monstrous attention on him, the air. The ripe fruit ready for the picking. The shifting mass of darkness began to drift slowly, inexorably, towards the prince, the psychic drone intensifying, becoming a physical force that pushed people aside and made the very stones of the castle groan. Johann Conrad, his own face a grimace of pain and effort, shoved Thomas forward. "The stone. It is the anchor. It must be broken, or the connection severed. The prince must see you. He must understand that the stone is the source, the contract." Thomas, his arms aching from the cold and the weight of the obsidian slab, his mind reeling from the audible whispers and the sheer visceral horror of the entity's presence, stumbled towards the petrified prince. The air around the entity was like wading through thick, freezing mud, each step requiring a Herculean effort of will. "Your Highness!" Thomas yelled, his voice sounding thin and pathetic against the entity's drone. "Look! This is what your line bargained for. This is the Shadow Minister. This is the debt that comes due upon your father's death." He thrust the glowing stone forward. The prince's eyes, glazed with terror, flickered from the horrific apparition to the stone, and for a fleeting second, a spark of understanding, of horrific, world-shattering comprehension, cut through the panic. He saw the writhing symbols, felt the waves of malevolent power emanating from it, and the king's frantic writings, which he had always dismissed as the ravings of a madman, suddenly crystallized into terrifying truth. But the moment of understanding was also the moment of greatest danger. The entity, sensing its intended vessel was being influenced, reacted with a surge of violent energy. A tendril of pure darkness, cold and solid as iron, lashed out from the central mass, not at the prince, but at Thomas, aiming to smash the packed stone from his hands. Conrad was faster. He threw himself in front of Thomas, his own long blade, which seemed pitifully small against the cosmic horror they faced, flashing in the eerie light. He parried the shadowy tendril, and a shower of sparks, like miniature stars dying, erupted from the point of contact, the sound a screech of tearing metal that set teeth on edge. Conrad was thrown back by the force, crashing into a group of overturned chairs. But he was up again in an instant, his centuries of life granting him a resilience that defied his years. "The king!" Conrad roared over the din, his eyes darting towards the bed. "The link is the bloodline. The king still lives. While he draws breath, the transfer cannot be completed. The entity is here, but it is constrained. It cannot fully take the prince until the moment of death. We must protect the king." It was a desperate, insane strategy, to protect the dying monarch not from death, but from dying, to prolong his life by even a few minutes to buy them time. Thomas, still clutching the stone, saw the lead physician, a Dr. Heberden, cowering behind a heavy velvet curtain. "The king!" Thomas screamed at him. "You must keep him alive. Do something. Anything." The doctor stared at him as if he were mad, which, in the midst of a supernatural assault, was a reasonable assessment. But the authority in Thomas's voice, born of sheer desperation, seemed to cut through the man's terror. Nodding jerkily, the physician scrambled on his hands and knees towards the bed, where the king was now convulsing weakly. His eyes rolled. The room itself seemed to be coming apart. Tapestries on the walls burst into cold, green flames that gave off no heat. Portraits of past monarchs cracked, the faces contorting into silent screams. The temperature plummeted, and a thick hoarfrost began to crawl up the walls and across the floor. The Prince Regent finally found his voice, letting out a high, shrill wail of pure, undiluted fear as the entity loomed over him, the psychic pressure now focused solely on him, a crushing weight meant to break his will and make him a willing vessel. "No!" Stay away from me! I renounce it! I renounce the bargain! The prince shrieked, stumbling backwards and falling over a footstool. His renunciation seemed to have an effect. The entity recoiled slightly, the drone faltering for a second, as if the voluntary rejection from the air created a flaw in the ancient pact's logic. It was a vulnerability. Conrad saw it too. The pact! He yelled to Thomas, battling another shadowy tendril. It is a contract. It requires a measure of acceptance, of lineage. The prince's rejection weakens it. We must break the physical symbol of the agreement. Thomas understood. He had to destroy the stone. But how? It felt harder than diamond. He looked around the disintegrating room for anything that could help. His eyes fell upon the large, ornate fireplace, where a low fire still smoldered, its normal orange glow looking feeble and out of place in the green-tinged nightmare. Fire had reacted violently with the symbols in the vault. Could it work here? Holding the heavy stone tight, he staggered towards the fireplace. The entity, sensing his intention, redirected its attack. A wave of freezing darkness swept across the room, aiming to encase him in a tomb of ice. But the Prince Regent, in a surprising act of courage born of sheer self-preservation, grabbed a heavy silver candelabra from a nearby table and, with a guttural cry, hurled it at the shifting mass of the entity. The solid silver passed through the darkness without causing physical harm, but the entity let out a shriek of pure rage, a sound that seemed to fracture the air itself, as if the noble metal, a symbol of purity and earthly order, was anathema to it. The distraction was enough. Thomas reached the fireplace. Without hesitation, he used the last of his strength to heave the heavy obsidian packed stone directly into the heart of the flames. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The moment the stone, thrumming with otherworldly energy, made contact with the fire, the smoldering logs erupted into a column of blinding white light, just as they had in the vault. A sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering simultaneously filled the room, so loud it felt like his eardrums would burst. The symbols on the stone flared with an intensity that was painful to look at, and then, with a final, deafening crack, the obsidian slab split cleanly in two. A wave of pure force exploded outwards from the fireplace, throwing Thomas backwards onto the frost-covered floor. The entity in the center of the room let out an agonized, reality-tearing scream. The green light flickered and died. The psychic drone ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that was almost as shocking as the noise. The oppressive cold began to recede. The shadowy form of the entity wavered, its outlines becoming indistinct, like a nightmare fading upon waking. It seemed to stretch and thin, pulling apart at the seams of reality, its malevolent presence unraveling. With a final, whispery sigh that seemed to suck all the sound from the room, the entity collapsed in on itself and vanished, leaving behind only the faint, fading smell of ozone and a profound, echoing silence. The green flames on the tapestries winked out. The hoarfrost on the walls began to melt, dripping onto the floor. The room was a shambles, filled with terrified, weeping courtiers and stunned physicians. The Prince Regent was sobbing openly on the floor, clutching the silver candelabra like a holy relic. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was the ragged, labored breathing of King George III from the bed. Dr. Heberden, pale and trembling, looked up from the king's side. His Majesty, his pulse, it strengthens. The crisis. I believe it has passed. The king had not died. The moment of transfer had come and gone, and the entity had been thwarted. The debt had not been paid. Thomas lay on the floor, gasping for air, his body bruised and exhausted, his mind a numb blank. Conrad walked over to him, his clothes torn and a cut bleeding on his forehead, but his eyes were alive with a light Thomas had never seen in them before, a light that looked like hope. He offered a hand and pulled Thomas to his feet. They had done it. They had faced a horror from beyond the stars and won. But as Thomas looked at the two broken halves of the pack stone, now lying blackened and inert in the fireplace, and then at the terrified, weeping prince who would now one day become king, he knew that the victory was not absolute. The entity was banished, not destroyed. The bloodline of Hanover still carried the taint of the bargain. And Sir Reginald Thorne was still out there, wounded but alive, a keeper of a secret that had not been erased, only postponed. The battle was over, but the war for the soul of the monarchy had just begun, and Thomas Harland, the junior archivist, was now irrevocably a soldier in it. The silence in the room was not peace. It was the calm after the storm, and Thomas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the entity's touch, that another storm was always on the horizon. The profound, ear-ringing silence that followed the entity's vanquishing was a fragile vessel, and it was shattered not by a new supernatural threat, but by the all-too-human sound of the bedchamber doors being smashed open from the outside. As a contingent of the prince's own personal guards, alerted by the ungodly noises and the panic of the courtiers who had finally managed to wrench the doors open, came pouring into the room with swords drawn and muskets leveled, their faces a mixture of professional discipline and sheer, bewildered terror at the scene of destruction that greeted them. The scorched tapestries, the frosted walls now dripping with meltwater, the overturned furniture, the weeping nobles, and their future kings sobbing on the floor clutching a candelabra. In an instant, the focus of the room shifted from cosmic horror to immediate, earthly peril, and as the guards' eyes scanned for a threat, they naturally fell upon the two disheveled, unknown men standing near the fireplace. Thomas Harland, his disguise melted away by sweat and struggled to reveal the face of the wanted archivist, and Johann Conrad, a grizzled, armed stranger with a blade still in his hand. "Seize them!" a captain roared, pointing directly at Thomas and Conrad, and in that moment, any explanation was impossible. They were the obvious catalysts for the chaos, the blasphemous intruders who had defiled the king's death chamber. Thomas's brief feeling of victory evaporated, replaced by the cold certainty of the gallows. How could they possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe a tale of ancient entities and soul pacts? To the guards, they were assassins or practitioners of black magic. Conrad, however, did not surrender. With a speed that belied his age and injuries, he grabbed Thomas's arm and shouted, "The passage!" and shoved him back towards the small servants' door through which they had entered. Musket balls tore into the woodwork around them as they dove through the opening, Conrad slamming the flimsy doors shut and jamming it with a piece of broken timber from a nearby crate. The sound of shouting and pounding immediately erupted from the other side. "They will not be delayed for long," Conrad gasped, as they stumbled down the dark, narrow passage. "Our only hope now is the prince himself. He saw. He knows. But he is in shock. We must disappear until he regains his senses and can countermand the order for our arrest." Their flight through the castle's hidden arteries was a desperate blur, a nightmare inversion of their careful infiltration. The news of the events in the king's chamber spread through Windsor like wildfire, and the entire fortress was soon teeming with agitated soldiers and servants. Alarms were ringing. Their descriptions were being circulated. There were rats in a wall, and the castle was being systematically shaken. Conrad, drawing on his centuries of knowledge of the castle's secret passages, knowledge gained from his long role as the Shadow Minister's agent, led them on a dizzying route through priest holes, behind crumbling walls, and down disused staircases that smelled of rats and decay. They emerged finally into the shocking freshness of the open air, hidden deep within the secluded, wooded gardens of the lower ward, the imposing bulk of the castle looming over them, its every window seeming to hold a watching eye. They crouched panting in the damp undergrowth, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the hellish atmosphere of the bedchamber. Thomas's body trembled with exhaustion and delayed shock. "What now?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We cannot stay here. They will search every inch of the grounds." Conrad was peering through the bushes, his face etched with a new kind of worry. "Thorn," he said quietly. "He escaped the vault. He is wounded, but he is still the keeper. He will be more dangerous than ever. He knows the pact is broken, the entity banished. His life's work is in ruins. He will not rest until he silences us and tries to re-establish the connection. He has resources we cannot imagine." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a new sound reached them, not the generalized clamor of the search, but the purposeful baying of hounds. They had brought out the bloodhounds. Their time had just run out. "The river," Conrad said, his decision made in an instant. "It is our only chance. The water will break our scent." They broke from cover and ran, dodging between trees and across moonlit lawns, the baying of the hounds growing steadily closer, more excited. They could hear shouts now, the sounds of the hunt converging on them. They burst out onto the banks of the Thames, the dark, swift-moving water looking like a ribbon of ink in the night. "Swim for it," Conrad commanded, already wading into the icy current. "Head for the opposite bank. We will regroup downstream." Thomas, who was not a strong swimmer, hesitated for only a second before the sight of torchlight flickering through the trees behind him spurred him into action. The water was breathtakingly cold, shocking the air from his lungs. He plunged in, striking out clumsily for the far shore, the weight of his waterlogged clothes threatening to pull him under. Conrad swam powerfully beside him, a steady presence in the terrifying darkness. Halfway across, a musket shot rang out from the bank they had left, and a ball kicked up a plume of water frighteningly close to Thomas's head. They redoubled their efforts, their limbs burning with the cold and the exertion. They finally dragged themselves, gasping and shivering, onto the muddy opposite bank, collapsing amidst the reeds. The hounds were going crazy on the far side, frustrated by the lost scent. They had a momentary reprieve. But as they lay there, catching their breath, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the trees lining the riverbank. It was not a soldier. It was Sir Reginald Thorne. His right arm was bound in a crude sling, his fine clothes were torn and stained with blood and soot, and his face was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred, lit from below by the small lantern he carried. In his good hand he held a pistol, aimed directly at them. "Did you think you could escape the consequences of your folly?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You have broken the world. You have unleashed chaos. That thing was the only thing holding the forces of anarchy at bay. Without the bargain, the line is vulnerable. The Stuarts will rise again. Revolution will tear this country apart." He was raving, a fanatic whose entire cosmology had been destroyed. "You speak of order, Thorne, but you serve the monster," Conrad said, rising slowly to his feet, his hands open at his sides. "The only chaos is the one you invited into our world. It was a necessary monster." Sir Reginald screamed, the pistol wavering in his hand. "And you, Conrad, you were its hand. You do not get to repent. You are as damned as I am. This scribbler." He gestured contemptuously at Thomas. "He is just a fool. But you are a traitor to the very power that granted you life." In that moment of Sir Reginald's distracted fury, Conrad moved. He didn't try to attack. He simply took a step to the side, putting himself directly between the pistol and Thomas. "Run, Harland," Conrad said, his voice calm, his eyes never leaving Sir Reginald's. "Your part is not over. The prince must be guided. The truth must be guarded. Run." Thomas stared, frozen. He couldn't leave him. The pistol shot was deafening in the quiet night. Conrad jerked backwards, a dark stain spreading high on his chest. He staggered but did not fall, a look of profound sadness on his face. Sir Reginald, his face a grotesque mixture of triumph and despair, fumbled to reload his pistol. That was the moment Thomas knew he had to go. With a sob of anguish, he turned and fled into the darkness of the woods, the image of Conrad's sacrifice burning itself into his soul. He ran until his lungs felt like they were on fire, until the sounds of the river and the castle were far behind him. He collapsed at the base of a giant oak tree, alone, hunted, and grieving. The entity was gone, the king lived, but the cost had been immense. Conrad was likely dead. He was a fugitive with a price on his head. And somewhere in Windsor Castle, a terrified Prince Regent had to come to terms with a truth that would forever haunt his reign. The pact was broken, but the shadow of Herrenhausen would linger for generations. And Thomas Harland, the accidental hero, was now the sole keeper of a secret too terrible for the world to know, a man forever exiled from the ordinary life he had once known, destined to live in the shadows, waiting for the day when the ancient debt might once again be called, and a new guardian would be needed. The storm had passed, but he was now forever adrift in its aftermath. The woods on the far side of the Thames were not the tame, managed forests of Windsor Great Park but a wild, ancient expanse known as the wilderness, a remnant of the primeval woodland that had once covered England, and as Thomas Harland fled deeper into its oppressive embrace, the guttural baying of the bloodhounds and the shouted commands of the soldiers fading behind him, the enormity of his solitude crashed down upon him. with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath not from exertion but from a despair so complete it felt like drowning on dry land. He was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, a man who had stepped out of the pages of history and into a nightmare from which there was no waking, his clothes soaked and freezing from the river, his body a tapestry of bruises and cuts, his mind haunted by the final, devastating image of Johann Conrad taking the pistol shot meant for him, the look of sad resignation on the ancient man's face as he sacrificed his own chance at redemption to give Thomas, the insignificant archivist, a few more moments of life. He stumbled on, driven by a blind, animal instinct to put distance between himself and his pursuers, the darkness beneath the canopy so absolute that he frequently collided with unseen trees, his hands and face scratched bloody by grasping thorns, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the psychic wound of all he had lost and witnessed. He had no plan, no destination, no hope. He was a ghost, a non-person, and if he were caught, his story would die with him on the gallows, dismissed as the ravings of a madman who had desecrated the king's deathbed. The night seemed to last an eternity, a long, cold descent into a personal hell where every rustle of leaves was a guardsman, and every hoot of an owl was a signal of his discovery. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the dense foliage, revealing a landscape of gnarled oaks and choked undergrowth, Thomas found himself at the edge of a small, peat-colored stream. He collapsed on its bank, his body finally giving out, and he drank greedily of the cold, bitter water, the act a simple, primal reminder that he was still alive. It was there, in the crushing silence of the morning, that the full weight of Conrad's final words settled upon him. Your part is not over. The prince must be guided. The truth must be guarded. They were not a comfort. They were a condemnation, a life sentence passed down in a muddy stream. How could he, a fugitive with no resources, no friends, and a face on every wanted poster, possibly guide a future king? The Prince Regent had seen the entity, had felt its horror, but he was a man known for his shallow appetites and his ability to bury unpleasant truths beneath a mountain of luxury and denial. Would he, upon reflection, convince himself it was a mass hallucination, a fever dream brought on by the stress of his father's impending death? Would Sir Reginald Thorne, wounded but still powerful, already be whispering in his ear, spinning a new lie to explain the events and shifting all blame onto Thomas and Conrad as foreign agents or practitioners of witchcraft? The thought was paralyzing. He had to assume that the official narrative would cast him as the villain. His only chance, a slim and desperate one, was that the shock had been so profound that it had forged a crack in the prince's carefully constructed world of self-indulgence, a crack through which the terrifying truth had permanently seeped. But to reach that crack, he needed to survive. He needed to disappear completely. The first order of business was to shed his identity. His own clothes were a liability. Forcing himself to his feet, he followed the stream until he came upon a small, tumble-down charcoal burner's hut, long abandoned, its roof half collapsed. Inside, amidst the debris, he found a moth-eaten, coarse woolen blanket and a tattered, hooded smock that had been left behind. It was filthy and smelled of damp and decay, but it was a disguise. He stripped off his own wet, distinctive clothes and buried them deep under a pile of leaves and dirt, pulling on the rough, scratchy smock. He smeared mud on his face and hands, not just as a further disguise but to cover the paleness of his skin. Looking at his reflection in the stream, he saw a wild man, a beggar, a creature of the woods. Thomas Harland was gone. Now he needed a new name, a new story. He became John Smith, a simple, common name that would draw no attention. He was an itinerant laborer, his mind addled by a fever, searching for work after being turned out by his master. It was a story that explained his disorientation and his lack of connections. For the next few days, he lived like a hunted animal, moving by night, scavenging for berries and roots, stealing a few eggs from a remote farmstead, his body growing thinner, his beard growing wild. He avoided all human contact, circling wider and wider away from Windsor, his only compass the need to put as much distance as possible between himself and the epicenter of the storm. He slept in ditches and under hedges, the cold earth his bed, the sky his roof, and every sound in the night jolted him awake, his heart pounding with the expectation of discovery. It was during this time of rootless wandering that a plan began to form, not as a flash of inspiration but as a slow, grim acceptance of his new reality. He could not guide the prince from a position of power or influence. That door was forever closed. But he could guide him from the shadows, as a keeper of a different kind. He needed to become a ghost in the machine of the kingdom, a whisperer of truths. And to do that, he needed two things: information and a secure place from which to operate. He thought of the King's Lynn repository, the remote archive to which he had originally been exiled. It was a place of forgetting, a dumping ground for documents deemed unimportant. But in its very obscurity lay its value. Who would look for a wanted fugitive in a place dedicated to oblivion? And within its dusty halls lay something else: records. Not the curated, sanitized history of the main archives, but the raw, unvarnished paperwork of the kingdom, shipping manifests, local court records, correspondence from minor officials. It was a treasure trove of information, a place where he could monitor the pulse of the nation without being seen, a place where he could begin to piece together the aftermath of that night, and watch for any signs of the entity's lingering influence or Sir Reginald's machinations. The journey to Norfolk was a harrowing ordeal. He traveled on foot, sticking to back roads and field paths, begging for scraps of food when his hunger became unbearable, his story of being a fever-addled laborer earning him pity and a crust of bread but no suspicion. He joined the flow of other rootless people displaced by enclosure and poverty, becoming just another anonymous face in the great, suffering mass of humanity that was invisible to the powerful. It took him weeks, but finally the flat, windswept landscape of Norfolk greeted him, and the grim, grey stone building of the King's Lynn repository came into view, perched on the bleak coast like a forgotten sentinel. Using his knowledge of archival procedures, he waited until the single, aging keeper had left for the day and picked the simple lock on a side door. The inside was exactly as he had imagined, vast, cold, and filled with the smell of decaying paper and salt air. Towers of crates and shelves stretched off into the darkness. It was perfect. He found a small, dry storeroom near the back, hidden behind a stack of naval records from the Napoleonic Wars, and made it his home. He became a phantom of the archives, emerging only at night to forage for food in the town or fish from the deserted shore, and spending his days immersed in the endless sea of documents. He started with recent newspapers from London, reading the official accounts of the disturbance at Windsor. As he expected, the story was a masterpiece of misdirection. It spoke of a criminal attempt on the king's life by persons unknown, who had used pyrotechnics and noxious fumes to create a panic. The king, by the grace of God, had survived the attack and was showing remarkable signs of recovery. The Prince Regent was praised for his steadfast courage during the ordeal. There was no mention of an entity, no mention of Thomas Harland or Johann Conrad by name. The keepers had done their work well. The truth had been buried beneath a mountain of official lies. But Thomas kept reading and watching. He requested shipping logs, passenger manifests from the German states, any communication from Hanover. He was looking for a pattern, for any sign that Sir Reginald was attempting to re-establish contact with the source of the bargain. He read court circulars, looking for any mention of the Prince Regent's behavior, any hint of the profound psychological shock he must have endured. For months, there was nothing. Life in the repository settled into a bleak routine. He was safe, but he was a prisoner of his own secret. Then, a year after his arrival, a small, seemingly insignificant notice in a London newspaper caught his eye. It reported the death of Sir Reginald Thorne, keeper of the Royal Archives, from a sudden fever. The obituary was brief and respectful, praising his long service. Thomas felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the repository. A fever? Or had his wounds from that night been more serious than they seemed? Or, more darkly, had the entity, or whatever remained of it, exacted a price for his failure? The death of his enemy brought no satisfaction, only a deepening of the mystery. With Sir Reginald gone, who was the keeper now? Was the pack truly over, or was there another, waiting in the wings? That same week, a crate arrived from Windsor, part of a routine transfer of non-essential documents. With trembling hands, Thomas opened it. Inside, amidst bundles of tax records, he found a small, leather-bound journal. It was not official. It was personal. And on the first page, in a handwriting he recognized with a jolt that stopped his heart, was an inscription. For the guardian of the truth, wherever you may be. The work continues. J.K. Johann Conrad had survived. He had not only survived, but he had managed to send a message, a sign that Thomas was not alone. The journal was empty, but its very existence was a beacon of hope. Thomas Harland, the phantom archivist, clutched the journal to his chest in the silence of the repository. The storm had passed, but the watch had begun. He was the keeper now, the guardian in the shadows, and his vigil, he knew, would last a lifetime. The dead of Herrenhausen might have been broken, but the echoes of that dark bargain would reverberate through the ages, and he would be there, listening. The empty journal, its soft leather cover bearing the faint, hopeful imprint of Johann Conrad's initials, became for Thomas Harland not merely a message from a world he thought lost but a sacred talisman, the foundational text of his new, shadow-bound existence. A physical proof that he was not a solitary man howling truths into a void but a soldier in a secret, endless war whose other commanders were ghosts and whose battlefields were the forgotten corners of history. And from that moment on, his life in the King's Lynn repository transformed from a desperate hiding place into a purposeful, if monastic, vigil, the bleak, cavernous hall of decaying documents no longer a prison but a fortress library from which he would wage his silent campaign. The first thing he did was to inscribe the inside cover of the journal with a single line, a vow etched in ink as permanent as he could make it. The watch begins, January 29, 1820. Marking the day the journal had arrived, the true start of his vocation as the guardian. He then began his work in earnest, his methods evolving from a fugitive's frantic search for news into a scholar's systematic, lifelong study. He realized that to understand the potential resurgence of the threat, he needed to understand its entire history, to become the world's leading, if utterly unknown, expert on the House of Hanover and the occult shadows that trailed behind it. His days fell into a rigid, obsessive rhythm. By the weak light that filtered through the repository's high, grimy windows, he would work his way through the endless shipments of documents, his eyes scanning for any fragment of data that could be pieced into the grand, terrifying puzzle. He created a vast, clandestine filing system of his own devising, using empty crates and stolen ledger books to categorize information not by date or subject, as a normal archivist would, but by connection to the central mystery. One crate held everything related to the royal physicians, particularly those who had treated the king's madness, cross-referencing their backgrounds, their publications, their financial records copied from treasury documents, looking for any anomalous patterns, any secret payments or sudden wealth that might indicate they were more than doctors, that they were, as the king had hinted, active keepers of his condition. Another crate was dedicated to the court of George I and George II, a painstaking reconstruction of the political and personal landscape of Herrenhausen in 1727, searching for any mention of a shadow minister, or a mysterious counselor in the letters of ambassadors, the diaries of minor courtiers. Any scrap that might corroborate the king's story and give a clue to the entity's earthly methods of operation. He devoured texts on alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and early Germanic folklore, searching for parallels to the described bargain, for myths of beings that fed on lineage or sanity, building a comparative mythology of his own private horror. The world outside moved on. He learned of the death of King George III in January 1820, the old king finally succumbing not to the entity's claim but to simple, weary old age. The news was met with national mourning, but for Thomas, crouched in his repository, it was a moment of supreme, heart-pounding tension. He scoured every newspaper, every piece of correspondence that passed through his hands, for any hint of the supernatural, any strange occurrence surrounding the Prince Regent, now King George IV. There were reports of the new king's lavish, tasteless coronation, of his escalating debts and his strained relationship with his wife, Caroline, but nothing, not a single whisper, of a shadowy presence or a crisis of the soul. It appeared the breaking of the pack stone had worked. The transfer had been permanently disrupted. The entity, it seemed, had been banished for good. Yet Thomas did not relax his vigil. Conrad's journal, though empty, was a constant reminder that the work continued. If Conrad was alive, he was out there, watching from another angle, and that meant the threat, in some form, persisted. Thomas began to look for signs of Conrad's handiwork, for events that seemed to defy explanation but subtly reinforced the stability of the realm. A potential assassin having a sudden, fatal accident, a fire breaking out in a building holding sensitive Jacobite sympathizers, a key piece of legislation passing Parliament by a suspiciously narrow margin after an opposing MP fell mysteriously ill. He saw patterns in the chaos, the subtle fingerprints of a centuries-old agent still working to maintain the order he had once threatened. Years turned into a decade. Thomas's beard grew long and gray, his face weathered by the salt air that seeped into the repository. He became a creature of pure routine, his identity as John Smith, the simple-minded odd-job man who did occasional maintenance for the repository's new, indifferent keepers, so ingrained that he sometimes forgot he had ever been Thomas Harland. He spoke to no one except to mutter thanks for his meager pay, and the people of King's Lynn saw him as a harmless, eccentric recluse. Inside the repository, however, his mind was razor-sharp, his knowledge deepening into an ocean of interconnected facts and theories. He tracked the reign of George IV, a disappointing, selfish monarch, but crucially, a sane one, his vices entirely human. He tracked the rise of the Duke of Wellington and the political battles over Catholic emancipation, seeing in them not just politics but a testing of the nation's structural integrity, a test it seemed to be passing. Then, in 1830, George IV died, and his brother, William IV, ascended the throne. Another moment of potential crisis, another male heir taking the crown. Again Thomas watched, his nerves stretched taut. And again nothing happened. William was a simple, straightforward sailor, his reign unmarked by any hint of the supernatural. The pattern was holding. The journal remained empty, but Thomas began to fill it. He started writing his own entries, not as a diary of his life, but as a continuous, analytical report. He recorded his observations, his theories, his historical findings. It became a living document, a testament to the watch. He wrote about the young Princess Victoria, heiress presumptive to the aging William, analyzing her upbringing, her character as reported in the press, judging her suitability, her strength of will, wondering if the taint of the bargain could skip generations or if it had truly been extinguished. His life's purpose had narrowed to this single point, to ensure the line continued, unmolested by the shadow of Herrenhausen. The outside world continued to change in ways that barely touched him. He heard dim echoes of the Industrial Revolution, of new machines and railways, but his world was one of parchment and ink, of whispers from the past. Then, in the summer of 1837, William IV died. The moment had come for the young Victoria. Thomas, now a man in his 40s who had spent nearly half his life in hiding, prepared for the worst. He spent days poring over every newspaper that arrived, his hands trembling as he read the accounts of the accession. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain went to Kensington Palace to inform the 18-year-old princess that she was queen. The reports described her as calm, dignified, and resolute. There were no reports of strange winds, of chilling cold, of apparitions. The transition was seamless. Weeks turned into months, and then years. Queen Victoria's reign began, and it was a reign of bustling, confident, moralistic energy, the very antithesis of the Gothic horror that had haunted her ancestors. The entity, it seemed, was truly gone, its power broken not by magic, but by the stubborn courage of a tormented king, the sacrifice of a redeemed agent, and the silent vigil of a forgotten archivist. A profound, weary peace settled over Thomas. The immediate threat had passed. The watch, it seemed, had been a success. One evening, as he sat in his storeroom, the empty journal open before him, he took up his pen. For the first time, he did not write an analysis or an observation. He wrote a final entry. The debt appears paid in full. The shadow has lifted. The line continues strong and untainted. The watch, for now, may rest. Th. He closed the journal, feeling a weight lift from his soul that had been there for 18 years. He allowed himself to believe that his work was done. But history, as Thomas Harland of all people should have known, never truly ends. A few months later, a new shipment arrived from Windsor, containing the personal effects of a minor court official who had served in the household of the Duke of Cumberland, Victoria's unpopular uncle. Among the usual detritus was a small, locked strongbox. It took Thomas most of a night to pick the intricate lock. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a document, but an object. A small, exquisitely carved cameo, made of a jet black stone that felt unnervingly familiar to the touch. The same cold, smooth texture as the shattered Paxstone. The cameo depicted a profile that was unmistakably that of the young Queen Victoria. But etched into the back, in tiny, almost microscopic letters, was not a maker's mark, but a sequence of symbols identical to those that had pulsed on the walls of Sir Reginald's vault. And with the cameo was a single, unsigned note, written in a hand he did not recognize, a hand that was elegant, precise, and cold. The vessel may change, but the design is eternal. The watch continues. Thomas stared at the object in his hand, the peaceful resolution of the last few months shattering into a million pieces. The entity had not been destroyed. It had simply been waiting, adapting, shifting its focus to a new, young, and potentially vulnerable queen. Sir Reginald was dead, but a new keeper had risen. The game was not over. It had just entered a new, more subtle phase. The shadow of Herrenhausen had not lifted. It had fallen over a new generation. With a sigh that held the weariness of decades, Thomas Harland opened the journal once more. He drew a single, firm line through his previous, final, entry. Beneath it, he wrote just 2 words, a vow renewed for a battle he now knew would outlast his own life, a battle for the soul of a century that had only just begun. It continues. The 2 words, it continues, inscribed beneath the defiant line that struck through his premature declaration of peace, felt less like a statement and more like a sentencing, a life term passed down not by a judge but by the cruel, unyielding mechanics of a history poisoned at its root, and the small, cold cameo bearing the profile of the young Queen Victoria seemed to grow heavier in Thomas Harland's hand, its smooth, jet-black surface seeming to drink the faint light of his storeroom. The microscopic symbols etched into its back a silent, screaming testament that the horror was not a singular event confined to a mad king's death chamber but a perpetual, mutating virus in the bloodstream of the monarchy, capable of lying dormant for generations only to re-emerge in a new, more insidious form. The weariness that settled into his bones was deeper than any mere physical exhaustion. It was the soul-crushing fatigue of a man who has seen the finish line only to have it moved infinitely into the distance, and for a long, terrible moment, he considered the ultimate surrender, simply walking out of the repository and into the cold waters of the North Sea, letting the currents carry him and his terrible knowledge into oblivion. But the image of Johann Conrad taking a pistol shot for him, the memory of King George III's final, lucid cry of, "Begone!" and the sight of the Prince Regent's face transformed from arrogant entitlement to pure, petrified horror, these were ghosts that would not let him rest. He had been chosen, however accidentally, as a guardian, and guardians did not abandon their post. The cameo was not just a threat, it was a message, and more importantly it was a clue. The unsigned note, with its elegant, chilling script, "The vessel may change, but the design is eternal," confirmed the existence of a new keeper, one who was clearly aware of Thomas's existence, or at least of the concept of a guardian, and who was sophisticated enough to operate with a subtlety that Sir Reginald Thorne, for all his power, had lacked. This was no blunt instrument, this was a surgeon's blade. The first question was how the cameo had come to be in the effects of a minor court official. Was the official himself the new keeper? Unlikely. More probably, he was an unwitting pawn, a conduit, or the item had been planted in his belongings specifically so that it would eventually find its way into the archival system, a system someone knew was being watched. This meant the new keeper had access to the court, an understanding of the bureaucracy, and a terrifying patience. Thomas's mind, honed by 18 years of obsessive study, began to work again, shifting from a defensive vigil to an active investigation. He could not leave the repository. He was still a wanted man in the eyes of the law, and his identity as John Smith was his only protection. But the repository itself was his weapon. The cameo had arrived in a shipment from Windsor. That shipment contained documents from the household of the Duke of Cumberland, Ernest Augustus, the Queen's uncle, a man known for his conservative, autocratic views and his bitter resentment at being surpassed in the succession by his niece. Cumberland was a focal point of discontent, a magnet for those who opposed the young Queen's Whig-friendly government. Was he the new keeper? Or was he, like the court official, merely a vector, his household deliberately used as a channel to spread the entity's influence? Thomas spent the next weeks in a feverish re-examination of every document related to the Duke of Cumberland that had ever passed through his hands. He built a profile of the man's associates, his finances, his travels. He cross-referenced names with his existing files on known Jacobite sympathizers and occult enthusiasts from the previous century, looking for any lingering connections. It was painstaking, mind-numbing work, and it yielded nothing conclusive. The new keeper was adept at covering his tracks. The cameo itself was his best lead. He examined it for hours every day under the weak light of a stolen magnifying glass. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond that of a typical jeweler. The depiction of Victoria was not just accurate, it was capturing a specific, determined expression from her early portraits. The black stone was the key. It was not jet, which was warm to the touch and relatively light. This stone was cold and surprisingly heavy for its size. He remembered the feel of the packed stone, the same unnerving density. It was a fragment, he realized with a chill. Somehow, a fragment of the shattered obsidian packed stone had been recovered and fashioned into this cameo. This was not a mere symbol. It was a relic, a physical piece of the entity's anchor in this world, repurposed. This changed everything. The entity wasn't just a disembodied presence waiting for a chance. It had a tangible foothold, an object of power that was now in close proximity to the royal family. What was its purpose? To influence the young queen? To weaken her will? To create a new, slower form of possession suited to a female heir, something not accounted for in the original, male-centric bargain? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. He needed to warn someone. But who? He could not go to the authorities. He could not approach the Queen herself. The only person who might have the power and the belief to act was the same person he had tried to warn 2 decades earlier, the former Prince Regent, now the deceased King George IV. That door was closed. Then, he thought of Conrad. The journal had been a sign. If Conrad was alive, he was still out there, a seasoned warrior in this shadow war. He had to find a way to make contact, to tell him about the cameo, about the new keeper. But how does one find a ghost? He decided on a gamble. Using his knowledge of the complex web of antiquarian booksellers and clandestine printers who sometimes dealt in sensitive materials, he composed a carefully worded advertisement for a book that did not exist. He placed it in the personal columns of a London newspaper known for its obscure and coded messages. The ad read, "Wanted, a first edition of the Herrenhausen Compact, any condition. Inquire by letter to J. Smith, care of the King's Lynn Repository, Norfolk." It was a desperate shot in the dark. The title was a direct reference to the bargain, and the repository address was a clear signal to anyone who knew its significance. He had no hope that Conrad himself would see it, but he hoped it might reach someone in Conrad's network, a fellow watcher in the shadows. Weeks turned into months with no response. The cameo sat on his desk, a constant, malevolent presence. He took to keeping it locked in the strongbox it came in, unable to bear the feel of it. Then, one bitterly cold morning in the winter of 1838, a letter arrived. It was addressed simply to J. Smith, Repository. The handwriting was not Conrad's. It was the same elegant, precise script from the note that had accompanied the cameo. His blood ran cold. He had not flushed out an ally. He had attracted the attention of the enemy. The new keeper had taken the bait. With trembling hands, he broke the plain wax seal. The letter was short and devoid of any salutation or signature. "Your interest in obscure Germanic history is noted. The volume you seek is unique. A meeting to discuss its provenance may be arranged. Be at the Church of St. Margaret in King's Lynn at midnight on the last day of this month. Come alone." It was an obvious trap. The new keeper was inviting him into the open, to a place where he could be easily captured or killed. But it was also the first tangible connection he had to his adversary. To refuse was to remain in the dark, to cede the initiative. To accept was to risk everything. The choice was no choice at all. The watch required action. For the next week, Thomas prepared. He moved the journal and his most critical files to a new, even more secret hiding place within the repository. He studied maps of King's Lynn, planning multiple escape routes from the churchyard. He had no weapon but a sharpened letter opener, a pitiful defense against what he might face. When the night arrived, it was moonless and frigid, a thick fog rolling in from the sea, blanketing the town in an eerie silence. The church of St. Margaret, with its towering spire, loomed out of the mist like a spectre. Thomas, shrouded in his tattered smock, slipped through the graveyard, his heart a drumbeat in the stillness. The church door was unlocked. He stepped inside into the vast, dark emptiness, the air smelling of old stone and damp hymnals. A single candle burned on the altar, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. A figure stood before the altar, their back to him, clad in a long dark cloak. "You are punctual, Mr. Harland," a voice said, a cultured, calm voice that echoed softly in the cavernous space. It was a woman's voice. The figure turned. She was older than he expected, perhaps in her 60s, with a severe, handsome face, sharp, intelligent eyes, and hair pulled back in a tight, silver-streaked bun. She carried an air of immense authority, the authority of a duchess or a high-ranking abbess. "You know my name," Thomas said, his own voice rough from disuse. "Of course," she replied, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. "We have been aware of you for some time. The diligent archivist who would not stay buried. I am Lady Beatrice Chelmsford. And I am the one who now maintains the balance." "The balance?" Thomas echoed, bewildered. "You call that thing, a balance?" "The entity is a force of nature, Mr. Harland, like the tide or the wind. A destructive one, yes, but one that can be channeled, its power harnessed to ensure stability." Sir Reginald understood this, in his crude way. "My methods are more refined. The cameo is not a weapon. It is a regulator. A gentle, steady influence to guide the young queen, to strengthen her resolve, to make her a ruler of iron will, unassailable by the petty squabbles of politicians. The entity's energy, properly focused, can forge a monarch of unparalleled greatness." Thomas stared at her, horrified. This was far worse than Sir Reginald's fanaticism. This was a rational, intelligent evil, a perversion of duty. "You are mad. You are trying to use a demon to create a perfect queen?" "I am ensuring the survival of the kingdom," she said calmly. "The world is changing, Harland. Revolution is in the air across Europe. The old order is crumbling. Britain needs a symbol of unwavering strength. Victoria will be that symbol. And I will see to it, with the tools at my disposal. You have a choice. You can continue your feudal watch from your dusty hole, or you can serve a higher purpose. Join me. Your knowledge would be invaluable." The offer was so audacious, so blasphemous, that for a moment, Thomas was speechless. This woman saw the entity not as a monster to be defeated, but as a tool to be wielded. She was the new keeper, and her vision was more terrifying than anything that had come before. "Never," he whispered. Lady Beatrice's smile vanished. "A pity. Then the watch, for you, ends tonight." She made a slight gesture with her hand. From the shadows of the pews, two large, silent men emerged, moving toward Thomas with purposeful intent. He was trapped. The game had not just continued, it had escalated to a new, more dangerous level.